The state of Maine is discriminating against women by failing to protect women in women's sports. Pretty basic stuff.
Attorney General Pam Bondi announced a civil lawsuit against Maine's Department of Education on Wednesday. The state is defying President Trump's executive order barring transgender athletes from participating in women's and girls' sports.
Maine Governor Janet Mills has bucked Trump on Title IX since the president signed the order on February 5th. The state ignored the ruling throughout March, and now Bondi is threatening to withhold funding retroactively.
Joining us now is visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and co-founder of Moms for Liberty, Tiffany Justice. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me this morning.
So what can you tell us about the Trump administration's efforts to compel Maine, I suppose, to go in line with what Trump has declared will be the policy moving forward on keeping women in women's sports, men in men's sports?
Yeah, over 50 years ago, Title IX was enacted to protect women and girls and to ensure that girls had equal opportunities in sport across this country. And unfortunately, the Biden administration decided that they were going to try to rewrite Title IX to include sexual orientation and gender identity as part of the definition of sex. And what we saw was a Kansas federal court vacated that rule, said it was completely unconstitutional. And yet here we have Maine, the governor of Maine, saying that, in fact, males should be able to play in girls' sports. And I'm excited that President Trump, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, and Secretary McMahon are going to work to protect girls and women in Maine.
One of the interesting things about this debate is that it crosses ideological lines in one, I think, interesting way, which is Governor Mills is arguing that this is a matter of states' rights, and that the state of Maine has a law that essentially ensures that people born male but who have transitioned can participate in women's sports. The federal government's position is that federal law supersedes that. So it is an interesting point, isn't it, that a Democratic governor is making the states' rights arguments and Conservatives are making an argument for the power of the federal government, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely preposterous to think that a state can override civil rights of Americans. There are certain rights that are protected. Title IX is a federal law. President Trump has made it very clear through his executive order that he's going to protect women and girls. And overwhelmingly, Americans and even people in Maine are supportive of President Trump on this issue. We are concerned about girls' safety. We are concerned about fair play in sport. We had a young woman speak out at that press conference with AG Bondi, who was a Maine athlete who had been injured playing. So I think what we have to understand here is that this is about the civil rights of women and girls, and the idea that a state can claim states' rights and violate civil rights in their state is absolutely ridiculous.
You know, one of the fascinating things about Title IX is that I think you can argue it was intended basically to serve this exact purpose, right, of protecting or empowering women to have an equal participation in activities in an educational setting. If there's an interest in having a women's team or club, if there's comparative interest, a school is obligated to make that possible under Title IX, under this federal law. And this law has been, reinterpreted, I would argue, in recent times to apply to providing accommodations for transgender individuals. I say, well, isn't that something that Congress should have discussed and debated, and they could have passed a law to accommodate trans people in any number of ways, but to reread this 50-year-old statute to have something to do with this when it's clear that no one who passed that law at the time could have ever conceived of applying it to this situation. On one level, it's Congress just not doing its job and leaving things to the permanent administrators of varying ideological stripes to determine what the law actually means. But is this exactly what was intended by the law to protect?
Yeah, I think it is. And let's be clear here. There's no such thing as a transgender child. There are men and there are women. UK Supreme Court just said there are men and there are women. It's about time for America to catch up with Europe on this one, I think. And so, yes, this is meant to protect women and girls. And my message today is to parents. Speak to your school boards about this issue. I saw a superintendent in Maine who was on Fox yesterday speaking about this issue and saying that he's been directed by his school board to go along with the the federal government to protect the rights of women and girls in his district, and he's going to defy Governor Mills on this issue, and he is not going to allow boys to play in girls' sports. So parents, speak to your school board members. Make sure that tell them that you want to make sure your district is not going to withhold funding, and school boards, direct your superintendent to protect student funding in your state. It is finally time that a president, that the AG, that the Secretary of Education is going to withhold funding from a school for violating the civil rights of students. There's been a lot of threats over many years, but there's never been a dollar withheld over Title IX. In the 50 years of Title IX, the federal government has never withheld $1 from a school district. And there's a new sheriff in town. All it took was a president who was going to stand to his word, and Secretary McMahon who's going to make sure that girls are protected in schools. And it's really great to see this team that President Trump has brought together defending women and girls across this country. Overwhelmingly, it is what Americans want. It's what our Constitution says needs to happen. And we're going to continue to fight to protect girls.
Just to clarify exactly what you meant in one point there, Tiffany, you said in the context of that answer there's no such thing as a transgender child. You do believe that there are such things as transgender adults, or no?
No, sir. I believe that LGBTQ is LGB is sexual orientation. The idea of transgender is a mental distress that people are feeling, and Q is a political ideology that has no limiting principle. And so you see gay people all over America standing up and saying that their civil rights are in jeopardy because of the idea that transgender people who believe that they are transgender think that they should have protections under the law. I have a lot of compassion for people who may be struggling with their idea of gender identity. But there are men and there are women. There's no such thing as transgender, and it's about time that we help people to find the help that they need in order to feel safe and comfortable in their own body.
Well, what about, and admittedly this is a much smaller category, people who are intersex, which is a different thing from transgender, and I'm talking there about a very small proportion of the population who are in fact born with genitalia that isn't specifically only male or female. You acknowledge that that happens in a small number of cases, yes?
But there's still only XX and XY chromosomes. And in fact, if you're treating someone who has some type of intersex issue, giving them the opposite sex hormones that they would need would actually be very damaging to them. And so again, I don't think that it's right to use the idea of intersex as some way to expand the category of sex to include anyone that considers themselves to be transgender. There are men and there are women. There are XX and XY chromosomes. And again, I have compassion for anyone that is dealing with any type of confusion or distress regarding their biological sex. But, we got into this mess because we did not affirm the fact that there are men and there are women. We gave the idea that somehow you could have a gender identity that was different than your biological sex. That's absolutely not true, and it's time that we stand firm in that truth.
But that confusion that you speak of having compassion for, where do you think that confusion comes from? Like what causes that confusion, if it's as clear as you think it is?
Sure. I mean, what we've seen as far as the youth in America is a social contagion that has really captured, especially young women in this country. Abigail Shrier wrote a book, Irreversible Damage, talking about the fact that there was a social contagion amongst girls. We've seen also in schools, children being taught as young as kindergarten that somehow they could be a boy or a girl or neither or both. This type of confusion, as far as biological sex is concerned, is absolutely horrible. It's child abuse. It really, and what's happening in the schools is totally ridiculous. And so, gender ideology has no place in schools. President Trump has been very clear on the fact that he does not believe that gender ideology is something that should be taught in American schools, that we need to be protecting women and girls. And so, again, I have compassion for anyone that's struggling with any type of mental distress. And the best thing that we can do for them is get them the help that they need, not give them cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, and send them on a lifelong path of being a medical patient in search of something that they can never actually achieve.
Tiffany Justice, thank you so much for joining us to discuss. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next, Trump's latest target, is it Jerome Powell? Stay with us on Rising.